Reprise du débat, l'honorable député de Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see you in that chair. I'm going to split my time with the member from Edmonton, or St. Albert, Edmonton. For 2 years, Canadians have been living with COVID-19 restrictions, 2 years of lockdowns, not being able to visit loved ones, not being able to travel, 2 years of isolation. And while Canadians understood the need for various restrictions applied during the pandemic, despite the lack of consistency, despite the mixed messaging, despite the confusion, Canadians have done what was asked of them. But what today they can no longer be expected to live with is the indefinite nature of these restrictions, the timelines, the lack of data. They are noticing that leaders across the country, 10 provinces, are following the evidence and advice from public health officials, evidence that supports ending the mandates. Mr. Speaker, provincial leaders have lifted or have plans to lift mandates in their provinces. The only government in Canada that has no plan to lift restrictions is this one. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that members opposite will argue that their compulsion for continued mandates is somehow justified by public health officials. But, Mr. Speaker, Canada's own top doctor says that the Omicron variant is a game changer and that it has forced us to rethink vaccine mandates. Dr. Tam said at we are at a very important juncture, and COVID-19 policies need to shift from emphasis on requirements to recommendations. That's the government's own advisor. The government's own advisor says that the federal vaccine mandates are under review now because the science tells us that the COVID-19 vaccine, or at least the first 2 doses, offers very little protection against transmission of the variant. Advice once valued by this government now suddenly ignored in an attempt to drive division and dehumanize those who don't agree, doubling down on a tactic that some members of their own caucus have called out. The travel vaccine mandate has prevented approximately 6 million Canadians from travel within Canada. It prevents them from flying out of Canada. They cannot travel, they can't visit family and friends, they can't take international vacations or even fly across the country. They can't live their ordinary lives. Canada is the only country in the developed world that bans citizens from air travel. And if you couple that with Dr. Tam's statements of reevaluating mandates, one can deduct that the rationale for a ban on air travel is no longer justified. But the government seems to have a different view, one that suits their political narrative. They may see travel as a luxury, but what about work or work across federally regulated industries? Let me tell you about one of those industries that's pleading for fairness, for common sense, for conditions in line with anywhere else in the world. In fact, even with their competitors in our own airports, the air travel industry. The Minister of Transport's mandate for vaccinations enforced through an interim order, or interim orders, I should say, were implemented swiftly across the industry. And despite being a matter of health and safety, employers developed and implemented that mandatory vaccination policy without consultation. La majorité des travailleurs du transport aérien.
Most air sector workers have been complying with the policies, while at the same time other workers have been placed on leave without benefits, without access to health benefits. The industry has fully supported efforts to increase safety in the workplace and safety for the public and workers, just as all members in this House have done. We must underscore the disproportionate burden that non-vaccinated members have had to bear. These workers were mandated to work during the pandemic. And in many cases, they continued working during the pandemic. Unlike other workers whose workplaces were often shut and many of them could work at home, these workers were transporting PPE to other parts of the world. they worked hard, very often without health protections, to transport the goods we need.
Vaccinations ended up being the only tool employers relied on in the fight against COVID-19, and yet there are many tools to achieve the same goal. We know that. We've used it in other industries. We kept each other safe. Most were unimpeded by severe outbreaks. And at a time where employers are experiencing worker shortages, particularly in this industry, they're terminating experienced and seasoned workers. Employers and workers have the equal responsibilities to keep workplaces safe, and yet the failure to do so results in uneven and disproportionate consequences. For workers, the consequences of loss of employment, a well-paying unionized job with benefits and pension which impacts not just the individual but entire families. It's unlikely that these workers will find other employment that's unionized and stable, which will inevitably impact their family's standard of living. No one should lose their livelihood because of personal beliefs, particularly when alternatives to reach the same goal exist. The government knows that. We think workers who kept the industry flying during the most challenging times of the pandemic deserve better. By creating an end timeline and an end to this interim order and a path forward, the government can eliminate these employers' needs to terminate frontline workers we depended on, we celebrated during the height of this pandemic. They could do that today. Cases of the variant are receding in most parts of the country, and advocates for continued mandates are claiming the mantle of science to justify political positions instead of the evaluation of scientific findings that have turned up in each one of our provinces and across the globe. Just this week, a member of this House stood and offered masking advice to other members in this kind of contrived attempt to virtue signal superiority despite the clear rules in this place, based, of course, on expert evidence, presumably science, the same science that the government is relying on, and also worth noting, completely in line with what happens outside of the door of this place. That exchange suggests not only a disdain for those who follow the rules the member doesn't like, it creates an arbitrary standard on opinion masquerading as science, and that's exactly what we're hearing today. It's gross and it's purposeful, and in some respects it speaks to a continued deliberate attack on those who don't share the views of this government. We've seen that. And when Canadians see behavior like that, they lose their confidence in those who are responsible for public health decisions. The trust erodes. It suggests to them that the same disdain displayed for members extend to maybe people outside of this House. And perhaps it does, because in the absence of any data, benchmarks, timelines, plans to end these mandates, there really is nothing to suggest that continued mandates aren't just an opinion of this government. If it is, that's troubling. And if it's not, it requires an explanation that has not been shared, other than taking points delivered about science. Mr. Speaker, the intention of the mandates were predicated on increased vaccination rates. We have amongst the highest in the world. And when that narrative was no longer supported because of those high rates, the goalposts move. This week, it became about surgical backlogs, which is tragic and most certainly a capacity issue, but it's still inexplicable in relation to the continued federal mandate. And then it was simply a shoulder shrug from the Minister of Health stating COVID is still here, and of course it's still here. It will always likely be here. But I hope that that has not become the benchmark by which the determination of when to lift these mandates or when to drop these restrictions, I hope that's not the case. I hope it's not COVID zero that we're hearing from this government. Mr. Speaker, it's time to end these unjustified mandates, and I hope that members of this House realize that public experts, their own public experts, the government's own public experts, have said that it's safe. Provinces have said that it's safe. Public health officials have said that that is safe. I hope they agree with the Conservatives and lift the mandates so Canadians can get back to work and get their lives back.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire du leader du gouvernement.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's really quite abundantly clear when you read the motion and you listen to members from the Conservative Party that they have used their political science to make the determination that all federal mandates need to end today. Now, I don't know if they're feeling somewhat obligated because of their presence at the blockade protests, but I can suggest to you that it is highly irresponsible. And my question for the member is, does she not recognize that you cannot just wish the pandemic away, that there are and still is a need? In fact, take a look at what's happening in some of our provinces where there's greater concern in terms of other variants that are there. And I'm wondering if the member is prepared to say today that we have no pandemic. Like, why would she not at least have an open mind to what health experts are telling us?
L'honorable député de Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to remind the member that the National Immunization Task Force never called for vaccine mandates. The Public Health Agency of Canada never called for vaccine mandates. The Prime Minister himself, when gallivanting across the country during an election in the midst of this pandemic, said that he wouldn't impose vaccine mandates. You know when they imposed vaccine mandates? When it was politically expedient. So I'm not going to take lessons from the government on political science. That's exactly what they are practicing with this pandemic. That's exactly what we have seen for the last number of months, and it's a shame. It's a shame for Canadian workers that they turn their backs on.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Laurentide-Labelle.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a simple question. Given what we've been hearing for the last few days and what we've seen that public health has said in Quebec, it looks like there is an imminent sixth wave. In fact, it's already happening. I understand that everyone is sick of this. But given that right now we are proposing concrete solutions with the health transfers to face this sixth wave, and at the same time, on the other hand, people are saying, well, we should listen to people because they're sick of this. But I'm trying to understand this. Given that we're talking about immediately in the motion, couldn't we look at this more in the long term?
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the question. It's not just Conservatives calling for this. It's public health officials. It's public health officials across 10 provinces that have already lifted their mandates. It's countries around the world where somebody who may not be vaccinated can get on an airplane. We're the only ones where that doesn't happen. So absolutely it should be immediate. In fact, it should have been yesterday. And we can talk about the 6th and the 7th and the 8th wave, but every single public health official, including Canada's chief public health officer, has said that it's time to live with this pandemic. It's time to give Canadians their lives back.
Questions et commentaires de façon virtuelle, l'honorable député de Yorkton, Melville.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to bring to my colleagues' attention, it's a great speech, about a conversation on Ottawa radio station yesterday with an individual responsible for tracking the variants in the sewage treatment in Ottawa, and they've gone up. And he was asked about this, whether or not we should be doing what we're doing right now in lightening the mandates and giving people their lives back. And his comment was, it's not a problem that these are rising because immunity levels are rising at the same time. Wondering if she'd like to make a comment on that.
L'honorable député de Thornhill.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, and certainly the gentleman on the radio is in line with public health officials, with Dr. Tam, with health officials across the 10 provinces who have lifted restrictions. At some point, we have to give, we've got to give Canadians their livelihoods back. We've got to stop being vindictive about the punishments of mandates, particularly if they are not justified and there is no scientific purpose to say that they reduce any kind of spread. There are people who are not working. There are people who have lost their livelihoods. There are people that have lost entire incomes for entire families, and they cannot return to work, and we ought to think about that.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable député de Saint-Albert, Edmonton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of our Conservative motion calling on the NDP Liberal government to immediately lift all federal vaccine mandates. Mr. Speaker, when one listens to the members opposite and their friends in the NDP, we hear that it's all about science, that they're following the science. I say to members of the NDP Liberal government, through you, Mr. Speaker, where is the science? Where is the data? Where is the evidence? Where is the evidence, for example, that an unvaccinated trucker who spends most of his or her day working in isolation is a public health risk that somehow merits their being fired from their job? It doesn't take much delving into science. Indeed, it simply takes a matter of applying basic common sense to recognize what an absurdity that is. But that is precisely the policy of the NDP Liberal government. In the face of vaccine mandates that have infringed so significantly upon the rights and freedoms of Canadians, the very least that Canadians could expect is compelling scientific evidence to back them up, to demonstrate a rational connection between the mandates and stopping transmissibility and keeping Canadians safe from COVID. But, Mr. Speaker, after 6 months, this government has failed to tender any science, any data, any evidence whatsoever to demonstrate such a rational connection. And there's a very simple reason for that, Mr. Speaker, and that is because there is no rational connection. These mandates have nothing to do with science and everything to do with politics, politics of the worst kind. And millions of Canadians have suffered as a result. As a result of the NDP Liberal government's punitive vaccine mandates, millions of Canadians are unable to travel freely within Canada, unable to get on a plane or train. These same Canadians who are our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, can't leave the country for work, for travel, for health reasons, to be reunited with loved ones. They're stuck here at home. Mr. Speaker, this is a serious, unprecedented violation of the mobility rights of Canadians, contrary to Section 6 of the Charter and Article 13 of the Declaration of Human Rights and Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Mr. Speaker, when one thinks about not being able to travel within one's country, not being able to leave one's country, we think of the former Soviet Union. We think of East Germany. We think of communist China. But this is Canada, and this is the reality that millions of Canadians have been living through for the past 6 months. So extreme are these NDP Liberal vaccine mandates that Canada is the only country in the developed world that restricts air travel on the basis of vaccination status. The only country in the developed democratic world. Wow. Under this NDP Liberal government, Canada is now an international outlier in terms of restricting the freedom of movement of its citizens. And it, again, got to this point not because of science, but because of an arbitrary policy of this Prime Minister, who said some months ago that it was the policy objective of his government to impose the most restrictive COVID measures in the world, no matter how unrelated and unconnected to the science it may be. Mr. Speaker, we're not only talking about a severe infringement on mobility rights. We have seen tens of thousands of Canadians lose their jobs, lose benefits that they had paid into their entire working lives, stripped of the dignity of work, stripped of the dignity of their career, including men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces who have fought bravely and put their lives in harm's way to defend the freedoms that Canadians enjoy, who are now being threatened with dishonorable discharge because of a personal medical decision that they made. And this is happening in Canada, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, what these mandates are really about is control. It's about saying, do as we say. And if you don't, you will be unable to travel, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your benefits, you'll be vilified, and you'll be treated as a second-class citizen. How wrong, how un-Canadian, Mr. Speaker. Everywhere around the world, mandates are being lifted. In all 10 provinces, they have already been lifted or will be lifted. In most of Europe, even yesterday, New Zealand, which had a completely failed approach of getting towards zero COVID, announced that they are lifting their mandates, even New Zealand. And here we have a government that hasn't even provided a plan, hasn't even provided any metrics by which these mandates will be lifted. Instead, the government has allocated $37.4 million over the next 3 years to implement what were intended supposedly to be temporary measures and to making them permanent. Mr. Speaker, Canadians don't want to be controlled. They want to take back control of their lives. They want their freedom back, and they want it now. The only thing standing in their way is this Prime Minister and the NDP Liberal government and their punitive, discriminatory, and unscientific mandates that have caused enormous harm to Canadians. When the Prime Minister talked about imposing the most restrictive mandates in the world, if the Prime Minister's definition of success is being punitive, he has certainly succeeded at that at great harm to everyday, law-abiding, tax-paying Canadians who are upstanding members of their community. Mr. Speaker, end the mandates and end them now.
Yes.